The morning Maria Underwood counted her last coins on the wooden steps of Calloway's general store, she had no idea that the trajectory of her entire life was about to shift like the dry Kansas wind that swept red dust across the main street of Harlan's Creek. It was the summer of 1878, and the town of Harlan's Creek sat in the broad, flat belly of southwestern Kansas, a small but determined settlement of perhaps 300 souls who had carved their existence from the unforgiving prairie with nothing more than stubbornness and calloused hands. The streets were unpaved, rutted deep by wagon wheels and horses' hooves, and the buildings that lined them were mostly timber-framed affairs with painted false fronts that tried their best to look more permanent than they perhaps were. There was the general store run by Horace Calloway, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a small post office that doubled as a telegraph station, a barber shop, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a handful of other enterprises that kept the settlement breathing. To the north and west, cattle ranches spread themselves across the grassland, some modest homesteads barely holding together, others larger operations that shipped beef east along the railroad that ran through the bigger town of Dodge City, some 30 miles distant. Maria was 24 years old and had been living in Harlan's Creek for going on 3 years. She had come west from Ohio with her father, a man named Thomas Underwood, who had believed wholeheartedly in the promise of cheap land and a fresh beginning. Thomas had filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of grassland 8 miles north of town and had thrown himself into the work with everything he had. He had built a small but solid house of limestone blocks that he quarried himself from a nearby creek bed, had broken sod until his hands bled, and had planted crops that the Kansas sky had promptly destroyed with hail one season, drought another, and a plague of grasshoppers the season after that. Still, Thomas had not quit. He had kept trying, kept mending fences, kept coaxing water from the ground with a hand pump he had installed himself. Then the fever had come in the spring of 1877. It moved through the settlement quietly, the way terrible things often do, and it had taken Thomas Underwood in less than 2 weeks. Maria had sat with him until the end, holding his rough hand and telling him that she was going to be just fine, which was something she believed not one word of at the time, but which seemed to be what he needed to hear in order to let go. After the funeral, she had found herself alone on 160 acres with a limestone house, a milk cow named Bess, 4 chickens, a vegetable garden, and almost no money. She had gone over her father's papers and found that he had taken a small loan from the bank in Dodge City to purchase seed and some equipment, and that loan was still outstanding. The bank had been patient so far, perhaps because the amount was modest and because Mr. Rutherford, the bank manager who made occasional trips to Harlan's Creek, was not an entirely heartless man. But patience at a bank in 1878 Kansas was a resource as finite and precarious as water in a dry summer. Maria had managed. She had sold eggs, traded labor with neighboring homesteaders, taken in mending work, and occasionally sold produce from her garden to Calloway's store when she had enough to spare. She was not a woman who gave in to despair easily. Her mother, who had died when Maria was 12, had instilled in her a kind of quiet determination that looked from the outside like composure, but was on the inside something closer to a continuous, careful act of will. She had her mother's dark brown eyes and her father's square jaw, and when she pressed her lips together and looked at a problem, she looked like a person who intended to solve it. But this particular morning in late July, the summer heat already shimmering off the packed earth of the street at 9 o'clock, Maria was sitting on the bottom step of Calloway's general store with her small leather coin purse open in her lap, counting out what she had. She had a list folded in her hand, a list she had written and rewritten 3 times the night before, crossing things off and adding things back, trying to find some combination that would cover what she needed most: cornmeal, salt, coffee, lard. A spool of heavy thread, because the hem of her working skirt had finally given out entirely and she could not keep pinning it. Possibly, if there was enough, a small tin of kerosene for the lamp, because she had been going to bed earlier and earlier these last weeks to save it. She had laid the coins out on her palm and counted them twice, and both times she had come up short by 32 cents. Not a catastrophic amount, not something that would have mattered to many people in many circumstances. But it mattered here in 1878 to a woman alone on a homestead with a bank loan hanging over her head and no one to ask. She was not crying. She would not allow herself that. But her expression as she looked at the coins was one of concentrated, private grief, the kind that does not make a sound. Lionel Easton had ridden into Harlan's Creek that morning with no particular plan, beyond getting his horse reshod at the blacksmith, and picking up the mail that had been accumulating at the post office for the Double E Ranch, which sat 12 miles southeast of town, and which he managed as foreman for its owner, a cattle baron named Gerald Estabrook, who spent most of his time in Kansas City, and left the actual running of the operation to Lionel. Lionel was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of a man who has done physical work every day of his adult life, with dark blonde hair that had been bleached nearly amber by the Kansas sun, a jaw that carried a few days of stubble, and a pair of light gray eyes that had a quality of stillness to them, the kind of stillness that comes not from emptiness, but from someone who watches the world carefully and thinks before he speaks. He had grown up in Missouri, the second son of a small farmer, and had come west at 18 when it became clear that the farm could not support two sons and that the older one would inherit it. He had worked cattle drives up the Kisham Trail when the trail was still running strong, had learned the business from the ground up alongside men who were older and harder than himself, and had eventually found his way to Gerald Estabrook's operation, where he had made himself indispensable through a combination of competence, reliability, and the particular gift of knowing how to handle both cattle and men without either breaking down. He had a reputation in Harlan's Creek and its surrounding territory as a fair and honest man, which was not the most exciting reputation a man could have in the Wild West, but was in fact one of the most valuable. He tied his horse, a big roan gelding named Brunswick, at the post in front of the general store, meaning to step inside after the blacksmith, and it was then that he saw her. She was sitting on the lowest step, her dark hair pulled back neatly under a calico bonnet, her dress clean but visibly mended at the sleeves, and she was holding coins in the flat of her palm, and looking at them with an expression that Lionel recognized immediately because he had seen a version of it on his own father's face during bad harvests, that quiet, dignified arithmetic of not enough. He did not stare. He was not the kind of man who stared. He walked past her or started to, and then he stopped. He looked back once, and she was still counting, her lips moving slightly as she went through the numbers again as though they might come out different this time. Lionel was quiet about what he did next because he understood instinctively that a woman with that kind of pride, sitting on those steps with those coins, would not want an audience for the transaction. He stepped up onto the porch of the store without going past her directly, came around to the side door that opened into the back, and found Horace Calloway behind the counter arranging tins. Horace was a heavy-set man in his 50s with spectacles that had a tendency to slide down his nose and a disposition that was generally cheerful. He knew Lionel well, as he knew most of the ranchers and their people who came through regularly. "Easton," he said, nodding, "what can I do for you?" "The woman sitting on your front steps," Lionel said, his voice low. "Dark hair, blue calico bonnet. What has she got on credit here, or what is she likely to need?" Horace looked at him with a mildly curious expression, then glanced toward the front of the store. "That would be Maria Underwood, Thomas Underwood's daughter, out on the homestead north of Breckenridge Creek. She doesn't carry credit here, she always pays what she can, proud about it." He paused. "She came in twice last week and looked at the cornmeal and walked out without buying." Lionel absorbed that. What does a basic order look like for a woman on her own out there? Cornmeal, salt, coffee, lard, what else? Horace listed the essentials and then added thread when Lionel asked. The total came to $1.14. Lionel put the coins on the counter without any ceremony, and he did it the way he did most things, efficiently and without making a production of it. "You put her order together when she comes in," he said. "You tell her it's been seen to. Don't tell her by who." Horace tilted his head. "She's going to want to know. Then you tell her it was a customer who settled accounts this morning and left no name." He looked at the older man steadily. "I would take it as a personal favor, Horace." Horace Calloway had been in the general store business long enough to know when a man meant what he said and when this particular kind of favor was being asked in good faith. He nodded once. "All right, Lionel." Lionel stepped out through the side door and went around the building to get to the main street, and by the time Maria Underwood stood up from the step, folded her list, and pushed open the front door of the general store, he was already halfway down the block heading toward the blacksmith, and he had not looked back once. Inside the store, Maria approached the counter with the careful composure of someone preparing to negotiate, already mentally rehearsing which items she could put off another week. She placed her list on the counter and looked at Horace. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," she said. "Good morning, Miss Underwood," he said, already pulling down the cornmeal. "Your order's been taken care of this morning," she blinked. "I beg your pardon. A customer settled accounts on your behalf before you came in," he said pleasantly, setting the cornmeal on the counter and reaching for the salt. "Paid for everything on a standard provisioning list. You are all set." Maria stared at him. "I have not placed an order yet." "No, but I know what you need," he said simply, which was true enough after her 2 visits the previous week. "It is taken care of, Miss Underwood. No debt on it." She stood very still for a moment, and he could see her working through it, the surprise and the gratitude and the pride all arriving at the same time and not entirely agreeing with one another. "Who?" she said. "Left no name." "Mr. Calloway." "I gave my word," he said, meeting her eyes steadily and with a gentleness that was genuine. "You take your supplies. It was done in good faith and with respect. That is all I can tell you." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside she could hear the street sounds, a wagon going past, a dog barking somewhere down the block, a horse's hooves on the packed earth. Finally, she pressed her lips together and nodded. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was even but only just. She helped Horace pack the supplies into the cloth bag she had brought, and she lifted the bag herself, turning down his offer to have his boy carry it to her wagon. But at the door she stopped and turned back. Was it a man or a woman? Horace adjusted his spectacles. "I cannot say." She looked at him for one more moment, then stepped out into the brilliant Kansas morning with her supplies and her burning, unsettled curiosity. She did not see Lionel Easton that day. She did not know who he was. But she spent the 8-mile drive back to her homestead turning the thing over in her mind, feeling alternately touched and troubled by it, wondering who in Harlan's Creek would have done such a thing and why and what it meant, and whether she was meant to simply accept it or whether some form of repayment was owed. She decided, by the time she pulled her wagon up to the limestone house and climbed down to unload, that she did not know enough yet to decide anything. She would hold on to it. She would wait and see. The Double E Ranch in the summer of 1878 was operating at something close to its peak. Gerald Estabrook had made good investments in the years since the cattle drives were king, buying up land along creek bottoms where the grazing was reliable and sinking money into a breeding program that was producing animals of better quality than the raw longhorns that had been driven up from Texas in the early years. The work of running it fell almost entirely to Lionel, who managed a crew of 8 cowboys, oversaw the fencing and watering operations, kept the books with a neat hand, and corresponded regularly with Estabrook in Kansas City about markets and prices. He did not think about Maria Underwood obsessively in the days after that morning in the store. He thought about her the way a man thinks about something that has settled in the corner of his awareness, present but not demanding, something he keeps returning to without entirely meaning to. He wondered if she had gotten her supplies. He wondered who she was and what her circumstances were. He wondered, without allowing himself to examine the wondering too closely, whether he might see her again. He saw her 3 weeks later at the church social that happened on the last Sunday of every month during summer, a gathering that served as something between a religious observance and a community event, where people brought food and ate together after services, and the children ran loose in the churchyard, and the adults stood around in the shade and caught up on one another's news. Lionel usually attended these events because Estabrook believed it was important to maintain good relations with the surrounding community, and because Lionel himself was not a man who held himself separate from his neighbors. He arrived with 2 of his cowboys, brothers named Pete and Cal DeMario, who both attended every month with the primary aim of eating as much pie as possible. He saw Maria across the churchyard almost immediately, standing near the food table with a woman he recognized as Ruth Garrity, the wife of one of the neighboring homesteaders. Maria was wearing a dress that was not her working dress, a deeper blue with white trim at the collar, and she had her hair pinned up under a hat, and she was laughing at something Ruth was saying, and the laugh transformed her face entirely, opened it up, made it something much warmer and brighter than the composed, private expression he had seen on the store steps. He did not approach her immediately. He got himself a cup of water from the barrel and talked to a few men he knew, listened to a discussion about the summer's grass conditions and whether the fall roundup would go well, and all the while he was aware of where she was in the yard with a precision that he recognized, with some self-awareness, as something more than ordinary. It was Ruth Garrity who brought about the introduction, which Lionel had not planned and which caught him slightly off guard. Ruth was a brisk, friendly woman who knew everyone and thought that everyone should know everyone else, and she had been acquainted with Lionel for 2 years. "Lionel Easton," she said, appearing at his elbow with Maria in tow. "You have been coming to these socials for as long as I can remember, and I do not believe you have ever met Maria Underwood, who has been at the Underwood homestead since '75. Maria, this is Lionel Easton. He runs the double E for Gerald Estabrook." "Miss Underwood," Lionel said, and he removed his hat, which was a habit so ingrained it happened without thought. "Mr. Easton," Maria said, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that were, he noticed up close, very direct. Not unfriendly, but not soft either. The eyes of a person who notices things. They talked for a few minutes with Ruth present, about the weather and the grass conditions and the usual topics of the Kansas summer, and then Ruth spotted someone across the yard who needed to be spoken to and excused herself with the efficiency of someone who has accomplished a social mission and is moving on to the next one. Left alone with each other, there was a moment of quiet that was not quite awkward but had a slight formality to it, the kind of pause that happens when 2 people are figuring out whether there is anything real to say to each other. "Are you managing the Underwood place on your own?" Lionel asked because it was the most natural thing he knew about her and because he was curious in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. "I am," she said, and there was no apology in it. "My father filed the claim in '75. He passed last year." "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it. "Thank you." She looked at him steadily. "And you have been at the double E for how long?" "4 years," he said. "Came up from Texas operation before that. Trail drives. Until they slowed down, yes. Kisham Trail 3 drives." She nodded, and he could see that she was filing this information away in the precise and organized way that a person does when they are genuinely interested in understanding something rather than just making conversation. He liked that about her immediately. He was not a man who enjoyed conversation for its own sake. They talked for the better part of half an hour, moving from the churchyard food table to a patch of shade under the one large cottonwood tree that stood at the edge of the property. And the conversation was one of those conversations that opens up gradually, the way a door does when someone is cautious but not unwilling. And by the end of it they had covered farming conditions, cattle operations, the railroad and what it meant for the region, and the question of water rights, which was something Maria had strong and well-reasoned opinions about. He rode home that afternoon thinking about her considerably more than he had ridden into town thinking about anything. The next time he came to Harlan's Creek, 2 weeks later, he stopped at Calloway's store on the way back and bought a small bundle of ribbons, which he stood in the store holding for a moment and then set back down, because it was too soon and too much. And instead he asked Horace Calloway with apparent casualness whether Miss Underwood came into town regularly. Horace looked at him over his spectacles. "First and third Monday of every month generally," he said, "when she's not too busy at the homestead." "Thank you," Lionel said, and bought a bag of coffee beans and left. He came back on the first Monday of September and found her at the store, this time inside at the counter, and he tipped his hat and said good morning, and she looked at him with a flicker of something in her eyes that he thought might be pleased surprise, though it was brief, and she composed herself quickly. They walked out of the store at the same time and stood for a moment on the steps in the early September light, which was not yet cruel the way July had been but still warm, the sky that particular deep blue that Kansas does in fall. "I have been meaning to ask," she said, and she was looking down the street rather than at him, "about the settled bill at the store. In July." He was quiet for a moment. He had known this was coming. "Horace told me a customer left no name," she said, "but I have been thinking about it." She turned and looked at him then. "It was you." It was not a question. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "she absorbed this." "Why?" He considered several answers and discarded all but the simplest one. "Because it needed doing," he said, "and because you looked like you would not ask anyone to do it." Something shifted in her expression. Not softened exactly, but something opened a little like that door. "I would not have," she said, "and I intend to pay you back." "That is not necessary, Mr. Easton," she said, and there was a firmness in it that was not unkind. "It is necessary to me." He looked at her for a moment and then he nodded because he understood that and because he respected it. "As you like," he said. "The cornmeal alone would be 40 cents, she said. "I have figured it at $1.15 for a full order." "Horace is rounding up," he said. It was $1.14. For just a moment the faintest edge of a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. $1.14 then," she said. She reached into her coat pocket and produced the coins, counted out exactly $1.14, and held them out to him. He took them because not to would have been to insult her, but he held them in his palm and looked at them for a moment. "Miss Underwood," he said, "would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee? There is nothing else I need to do in town this morning." The pause was brief, but he felt every second of it. Then she said, "The restaurant next to the post office makes a decent cup." They had coffee together for the first time that morning at a small table by the window of Ida Marsh's restaurant, which served simple meals and was frequented by travelers and local business people and the occasional ranch hand, and which smelled of fry bread and wood smoke and coffee. It was a plain and honest place, and it suited them both. Over the course of an hour, they talked about things that people talk about when they are feeling their way carefully toward each other, testing the ground. He learned that she had studied at a proper school in Ohio until she was 17, that she read whatever she could get her hands on, that she had opinions about territorial politics and the treatment of the Comanche and Cheyenne bands who were being pushed onto smaller and smaller reservations, that she baked the best cornbread in Harlan's Creek, according to Ruth Garrity, and that she had a sense of humor that she deployed quietly and with perfect timing. She learned that he had taught himself to read at 16 from a Bible and a surveying manual, that he had a brother back in Missouri he wrote to twice a year, that he was saving money with the specific intention of buying land of his own someday, that he had a strong sense of what was right and wrong that he had developed independently and applied consistently, and that when he laughed, which was not often but was genuine when it happened, it changed his face entirely into something younger and warmer. She paid for her own coffee. He did not argue about it. He asked if he might call on her the following week, and she said that she would be at the homestead on Wednesday afternoon if he found himself in that direction. The Wednesday call became a regular thing. He rode out to the Underwood homestead on his day off, which was Wednesday, and they sat on the limestone step outside the front door if the weather permitted, or at the kitchen table inside if it did not, and they talked and drank coffee and occasionally argued, which both of them found they enjoyed more than perhaps was entirely respectable. He helped her mend a section of fence one afternoon, working alongside her without being asked, and without making it feel like charity, which required a certain delicacy that he managed naturally. She fed him dinner after, a venison stew with cornbread, and it was the best meal he had eaten in recent memory, which he told her, and she accepted the compliment the way she accepted most things, without dismissing it but without making too much of it. By October, the calls had taken on a warmth that neither of them was ignoring, but that they were circling carefully, like two people who have both been careful with themselves for long enough that they are not in any hurry to be reckless, even pleasantly reckless. The first time he touched her hand was entirely accidental. She was showing him a survey map of her homestead claim that she had spread on the kitchen table, explaining an issue with a boundary marker that she suspected a neighboring homesteader, named Bert Crabtree, was encroaching on, and she was pointing to a line on the map, and he leaned in to look, and their hands ended up side by side on the paper. He became aware of the nearness all at once, the warmth of her hand a few inches from his, and he did not move it away immediately. Neither did she. They both looked at the map for another moment, and then she said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "The corner pin should be right here, but when I checked last week it was missing." He said, equally steady, "I can ride out there with you and check the surrounding area. Corner pins get moved, sometimes on purpose." "I suspected as much," she said. They did not talk about the moment, but when he rode home that evening through the October dusk, he was smiling. He came back on Saturday that week with Pete DeMario, who was the ranch hand he trusted most, and the three of them spent a morning searching the boundary of the Underwood claim's northern edge, where the corner pin was missing. They found it eventually, pulled out of the ground and moved roughly 20 yards east, which would have put a significant strip of Maria's land inside Crabtree's claim if it had gone uncontested. Lionel drove the pin back into its proper position himself, and he and Pete built a small stone cairn around it that would be harder to move without detection. Maria watched all of this with her arms crossed and an expression that was equal parts gratitude and controlled anger at the situation. "I want to be clear," she said when they had finished, "that I appreciate this very much, and that Bert Crabtree had better not try it again." "He probably will not," Pete DeMario said cheerfully. "Now that we've cairned it, he'd have to be brazen about it, and Crabtree's a sneak, not a brazen man." "A useful distinction," Maria said dryly. Lionel found himself watching her as she turned back toward the house, and he thought that there was no one he had met in his adult life who he had found so steadily interesting from one week to the next. Most people he understood quickly. Maria he found he was still figuring out after 2 months, not because she was obscure or evasive, but because she was genuinely complex, with a depth to her thinking and feeling that kept revealing itself in new ways. He stayed for dinner again that day after Pete rode back, and afterward they sat by the small fireplace in the front room of the limestone house, the first fire of the season against the October chill, and she read aloud to him from a novel she had been working through, a story by a writer named Thomas Hardy that she had gotten from the circuit library that passed through town. He was not much of a reader of novels, but listening to her read was a different thing entirely, because she read with attention and a kind of understated expressiveness, and he found he was following the story closely. When she finished the chapter and set the book down, there was a comfortable quiet between them that he had not experienced with anyone in a long time, the quiet of two people who do not feel the need to fill silence with noise. "Maria," he said. She looked at him, waiting. "I would like to court you properly," he said, because he was a man who believed in saying what he meant and not dressing it up. with the intention of something serious. If that is something you would consider. She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight, and he could see her taking the measure of him the way she had been doing since the beginning, careful and honest. I have been considering it for some time, she said at last, whether or not you intended it. He felt something warm and real move through his chest. Then I am glad to make the intention plain, he said. She smiled at him then fully in the firelight, and it was one of the finest things he had ever seen. They began courting formally that October, though in practice it looked very much like what they had already been doing: the Wednesday visits, the Sunday socials, the occasional trip into town together. What changed was the way they were with each other, a certain ease that came in when the uncertainty lifted, a loosening of the careful formality that had been there at the beginning. He brought her wildflowers once, a late-season bundle of prairie asters he had noticed on the ride out, just tied with a bit of twine and handed to her at the door, and she put them in a tin cup on the windowsill and they stayed there until they dried, and even then she did not throw them away immediately. She was not a demonstrative person, not in the way of women in the novels she read, who fell into feelings headlong and often dramatically. She showed affection through attention and action, through remembering what he had told her and asking about it the next time she saw him, through saving the last of the coffee she had ground for a good pot when he was coming, through the particular quality of focus she gave him when he spoke, as though what he said mattered and she intended to understand it fully. He found this far more affecting than any grand gesture would have been. He, for his part, showed it through consistency. He was there when he said he would be there. He helped with things without making her feel like she could not handle them herself. He brought the news from town that she sometimes missed, being out at the homestead, and delivered it with enough commentary that she could form her own opinions. He listened to her opinions when she formed them, including the ones he disagreed with, and when he disagreed he said so and explained why, and they could argue a thing back and forth for an hour, and then drop it and move on to something else without either of them holding a grudge. November came with the first real cold, and with it, a piece of news that created a real difficulty. Maria received a letter from the bank in Dodge City, politely but unmistakably pointing out that the loan her father had taken out was past its extended grace period, and that the bank would need to begin collection proceedings by the new year if arrangements were not made. The amount was $87, which in the economy of 1878 Kansas was not a small sum for a woman running a homestead alone. She told Lionel about it on his Wednesday visit, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her, and her voice was steady, but her hands were flat on the table in the way they got when she was holding herself together. "What are your options?" he said, not offering solutions yet because he had learned that she wanted to think through things herself first. "I can try to sell the milk cow," she said. "That would give me perhaps $15. I have the eggs from the chickens, but the winter market for those is thin. The garden is done for the season. I have been taking in mending from 2 families, but it does not amount to much." She looked at the letter. "The most sensible option on paper is to sell the claim and pay the debt." "Is that what you want to do?" "No," she said, with a quiet intensity that made it clear this was not simply a preference. "My father worked this land until it killed him. I am not selling it." He nodded. He had known that would be the answer. He thought for a moment. "Esterbrook needs someone to winter a small herd on the north pasture closer to town so the cattle don't have to be brought as far in for feeding. He is looking to pay for use of land and a caretaker arrangement through to spring. Your acreage north of Breckenridge Creek would suit it." She looked at him carefully. "Are you inventing this?" "I am not," he said, and he met her eyes directly so she could see that. "It is a real arrangement he has been trying to sort out for 6 weeks. I have not mentioned your land because I did not know how you would feel about it." She sat back in her chair. "What does the arrangement pay?" "For the land use and someone to oversee the watering and check the herd through winter, roughly $1 a week, and the use of a good hay supply for your own animals." She was quiet, doing the math. 12 to 14 weeks of winter, $1 a week plus the hay that she would otherwise need to buy. It was not $87, but combined with what she already had it might be close. "Tell Mr. Estabrook I am interested," she said. The arrangement went through and it helped. By January, she was looking at a deficit of approximately $40, still significant but manageable if she could earn it by spring. And Lionel had quietly spoken to the bank manager on her behalf during a trip to Dodge City, vouching for her reliability as a debtor and asking for a further extension, which was granted in part because Gerald Estabrook had done business with that bank for years and Lionel's word carried weight by association. He did not tell her he had done this until February, when she found out through a mention in a letter from the bank that referenced the conversation. She was not angry about it exactly, but she came to the point directly. "You went to the bank," she said when he arrived that Wednesday. "I did," he said. "I would have preferred to know." "I know you would have," he said. "I was not sure you would have let me if I had asked first." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is probably true," she admitted. "But I need you to tell me when you do things on my behalf, Lionel. I need to know what I am standing on." It was the first time she had used his given name without his title, and he thought she might not have noticed she had done it, but then he saw the very slight color in her face and thought she probably had. "You are right," he said. "I will tell you." "Thank you," she said, and then, after a pause, "And thank you for doing it." He nodded, and she reached over and briefly covered his hand with hers on the table, a quick, deliberate touch that she then withdrew, but which he felt all the way to his bones. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard on the prairie. Snow came in January and stayed, and there were 2 weeks in the middle of the month where the temperature dropped to extremes that made traveling dangerous and kept most people close to home. Maria managed her small herd of wintered cattle with the competence she brought to everything, checking them daily and keeping the water trough from freezing with the system of hot rocks that Lionel had shown her in December. She kept Bess the cow and her chickens alive and in reasonable condition. She mended by firelight in the evenings and read and wrote long letters to a school friend back in Ohio and to Ruth Garrity, who was her closest local friend, and had become something of a confidant regarding Lionel. "He is a steady man," Ruth said, when she came for a visit in mid-January, sitting at Maria's kitchen table with a pot of tea between them. Ruth's husband had driven her over in the sleigh, which told you something about how much she had wanted to have this particular conversation. "Steady is underrated." "I am aware of his qualities," Maria said mildly. "Maria Underwood," Ruth said. "You are 24 years old and you are in love with Lionel Easton and you know it. I can see it from 20 yards. "He has not asked me anything yet," Maria said, which was the most she was willing to say on the subject. "He will," Ruth said, with the certainty of a woman who has been watching people long enough to know. "Give it until spring." The winter gave Lionel time to think, which he spent in the ranch house on long evenings going over the books, writing to his brother in Missouri, and examining what he wanted from his life with the seriousness that the cold and the quiet of the season seemed to demand. He had been saving money for land for 3 years. He had just over $400 in the Dodge City Bank, which was more than most working cowboys accumulated, and which represented a long discipline of modest living and consistent work. Enough for a down payment on a modest piece of land, not enough to do it without still working for wages for some years to come. He thought about Maria's homestead. He thought about the 160 acres of well-watered land with a solid limestone house that her father had built and that she had maintained. He thought about her, specifically and in detail, the directness of her eyes and the way she argued and the sound of her reading aloud, and the way she had briefly covered his hand with hers and then withdrawn it, as though she was still deciding how much she was willing to let herself need someone. He thought about the question of what he was going to do, and he thought about it until it stopped being a question. He rode out to her homestead on the first Wednesday of February, the snow still thick on the ground and the sky the white of low clouds, and Brunswick's breath steamed in the cold air. She met him at the door with the expression of someone who has noticed something in the set of a person's shoulders from 20 yards. "You look like you have something to say," she said. "I do," he said. He took off his hat and held it. "Maria." And then, because he was not a man who spoke in circles, "I want to marry you. I have been sure of it for some time, and I have been waiting until I was certain I could offer you something worth the offering. I am not a wealthy man, but I have some money saved, and I am reliable, and I intend to stay that way. And I am in love with you, considerably." The quiet that followed was very quiet. The snow lay thick and undisturbed around the house, and somewhere far off a crow called once and was silent. She looked at him with those direct dark eyes, and he could see everything moving behind them, all the careful accounting of it, the wariness of a woman who has learned that things can disappear and has built walls accordingly. "Lionel," she said. "Yes. If you had not settled my bill at Calloway's store last summer," she said, "we might never have spoken." "That is possible," he agreed. "I have thought about that more than once," she said. $1.14. He waited. "Yes," she said, and her voice was not small or uncertain but clear, the way she said everything that she truly meant. "Yes, I will marry you." He stepped forward and took her hand, and it was the first time he had done so deliberately, and she let him. And she looked up at him in the white winter light with something in her face that was not just composed now but fully open, the way he had sometimes glimpsed it when she laughed, but more sustained, more real. He kissed her, his first time, standing on the step of her limestone house in the snow, and it was careful and warm and serious, the kind of kiss that is a promise rather than a question. They were married in April of 1879, in the church in Harlan's Creek on a Saturday that was one of those perfect Kansas spring days where the sky is so blue it looks invented, and the prairie grass is just coming in green, and the wind is warm from the south. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Hale, who had been at the church in Harlan's Creek for 15 years, and who had buried Maria's father, and who seemed genuinely pleased to be presiding over something happier. Ruth Garrity was Maria's maid of honor and stood to her left with a bunch of prairie wildflowers tied with blue ribbon that she had assembled with characteristic efficiency and sentiment. Pete DeMario stood with Lionel, looking extremely uncomfortable in his good coat and collar but bearing it stoically. The pews were reasonably full, because it was a small community and a wedding was an occasion, and there was a feeling in the room that was warm and simple and real. Maria wore a dress she had made herself over the winter months, a cream-colored muslin with embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and she had her hair pinned up with small pearl combs that had been her mother's. She walked down the aisle with a composure that she almost, but not quite, maintained perfectly, and the slight brightness in her eyes when she saw him standing at the front was the most openly emotional he had ever seen her in front of others, and it was enough to make his own composure require some maintenance. When Reverend Hale asked the question and Lionel said, "I do," his voice was perfectly even. When Maria said it, hers was too, but she was looking at him with such directness and sureness that the whole church felt it. They signed the register together afterward and stepped out into the April sunshine, and there was a moment on the church steps, the same steps Maria had sat on 7 months before in the heat of July counting her coins, where they stood together in the new spring light and looked at each other as married people for the first time. He put his arm around her and she leaned briefly against his shoulder, just for a moment before straightening, and then she smiled at him, the full smile, and he thought that he would not trade that moment for anything on the continent. The community celebration after the ceremony was held in the churchyard and ran until late afternoon, with food that half the community had contributed and music from a fiddle player named Jensen who could keep a tune going for hours, and dancing on the packed earth, and a great deal of talking and laughing. Maria danced with Lionel twice, which was enough, and she danced with old Horace Calloway once, who moved with surprising lightness for a heavy-set man of his age. And she danced with Pete DeMario once, who moved with no lightness whatsoever but made up for it in enthusiasm. At one point in the afternoon, she found herself standing next to Horace near the punch table, and she said to him quietly, "You kept his secret well." Horace smiled. "I did try. He told me in September," she said. "I know. He came in and told me he had told you and asked if I was upset about it." He adjusted his spectacles. "I told him I expected it. You are not a woman who lets things go unresolved." "No," she agreed. "I am not." "He is a good man," Horace said simply. "Yes," she said, "he is." They moved into the homestead together, which required some practical adjustments. Lionel gave notice to Estabrook, who had known it was coming and who had, it turned out, been expecting it for years. Estabrook was a businessman before everything else and offered Lionel a consulting arrangement, where he would continue to handle the books and advise on major decisions but would no longer be full-time foreman. The arrangement paid less than his previous salary, but it was flexible, and it allowed him to work the Underwood land. Lionel had been thinking about the land since the winter, specifically about what it could produce beyond what Maria had been managing alone. The soil on the Underwood claim, as he had observed during his months of visiting, was decent but underused. The north section that had wintered Estabrook's cattle was well watered by the creek and had good grass. The south section, closer to the house, had soil that could support crops beyond the kitchen garden if it were properly broken and worked. He spent that first spring and summer breaking new sod in the south section, using a team he had brought from the Double E as part of his severance arrangement with Estabrook. 2 strong draft horses that he quartered in the small stable he spent 2 weeks building before anything else. Maria worked alongside him where she could, managing the kitchen garden and the household and the small herd of chickens that had grown to 8, and in the evenings they sat on the limestone step in the warm spring dusk and talked about what they were building, what they wanted the land to look like in 5 years and in 10. "A proper barn," Lionel said, on one of those evenings, looking out at the land. "Big enough to winter a decent herd of our own, not Estabrook's cattle, ours. There is a stand of cottonwood along the West Creek bend that would give timber for it," Maria said. She had been thinking about this too, he could tell. She had probably been thinking about it longer than he had. "I thought the same," he said. He looked at her. "What else?" "A second well," she said. "The hand pump is fine for the house, but it is not enough for a barn and expanded stock. If we can get a proper well dug by summer's end, the winter will be easier." He nodded. "I can hire the Garrity boy to help dig. He is strong and he needs the work." They were good at this, he was discovering. The practical partnership of it, the way their thinking fit together without requiring one of them to lead and the other to follow. She was precise where he was broad and he was patient where she was quick, and the result was a working relationship that doubled what either of them could do alone. In September of 1879, exactly a year after Lionel had watched Maria count coins on the store steps and quietly gone through the side door to settle her bill, they held a small dinner for a few close people to mark the occasion, though they did not announce it as such. Ruth and Daniel Garrity came, and Pete DeMario, and old Horace Calloway, who brought a small crock of preserved peaches that he presented to Maria with a formality that made her laugh. After dinner, sitting around the table in the limestone house that now had curtains Maria had sewed, and a rug Lionel had bought at the market in Dodge City, and a pair of oil paintings on the wall from a traveling artist who had come through in August, and to whom Maria had traded a week's board for 2 small landscapes, Horace told the story of the bill, which he had been sworn to secrecy on, and which he felt was now, after a year and a wedding, within his rights to tell. He told it with care and a certain amount of dry affection, and when he got to the part about Lionel standing in the back of the store and saying, "Keep his name out of it," Pete DeMario burst out laughing, and Ruth Garrity looked at Maria with an expression of profound satisfaction, and Daniel Garrity, who was a quiet man and not given to speeches, raised his glass and said simply, "Here is to $1.14, which was the best money ever spent in this county. Everyone drank to that. Later, when the guests had gone and the table was cleared and the house was quiet, Maria was washing the dishes at the basin and Lionel was drying, and she said, without looking at him, "Were you in love with me then?" "In July." He thought about it honestly. "I did not know you then," he said, "but I was interested in a way that felt like the beginning of something." She considered this. "When did you know?" He was quiet for a moment, drying a cup. "The morning of the boundary survey," he said. "When you crossed your arms and said that Bert Crabtree had better not try it again. There was something in the way you said it." He paused. "I think I knew then that I was going to propose to you eventually." She turned and looked at him with an expression that was thoroughly unguarded in a way she rarely was. "That was in October." "Yes. I knew in November," she said, "when you came through the snow for Wednesday coffee when any sensible person would have stayed at the ranch." She turned back to the dishes. "I knew then that I was in very serious trouble." He set down the cloth and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, her hands still in the basin, and they stood like that in the warm kitchen while the prairie night settled around the limestone house, quiet and full of stars. The bank loan was paid in full by November of 1879. Using the income from the Esterbrook consulting arrangement, the proceeds from the first sale of their own beef, 3 animals that Lionel had purchased in the spring and fattened through the summer on the Breckenridge Creek pasture, and Maria's earnings from the mending and the expanded egg trade. The morning the bank sent confirmation of the account being closed, Maria sat at the kitchen table and read the letter twice and then set it down and said nothing for a long moment. "Your father would have been pleased," Lionel said, from across the table. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright, but she blinked it away with the characteristic control that he had long since stopped reading as coldness. He knew it for what it was. "Yes," she said. "He would have been very pleased." She folded the letter and put it in the box she kept important papers in, and then she stood up and refilled his coffee cup and said, "I think we should get 2 more heifers in the spring. If we fence the north pasture properly before winter, we will have the capacity." "Agreed," he said, and smiled at her, and she caught the smile and returned it briefly and then got on with the morning, which was how they were, and which was exactly right. The spring of 1880 brought several things. It brought the completion of the barn, which went up in 4 days in April with a barn raising that drew 10 men from the surrounding community, including Daniel Garrity, Pete DeMario and his brother Cal, old Horace Calloway's oldest son, 2 cowboys from the Double E who came on their day off because they liked Lionel, and a few others. Maria fed everyone for 2 days straight, with help from Ruth Garrity and another neighboring woman. And when the barn was finished and the last person had gone home, and the 2 of them stood looking at it in the evening light, Lionel took her hand and held it, and she squeezed back. Spring also brought a letter from Lionel's brother in Missouri, a man named Robert, who wrote to say that he was thinking of coming west with his wife Agnes and their 2 young children to see what the country was about. Lionel wrote back to say that they were welcome, and that if Robert was thinking of making a go of it out here, there was land to the east of the Underwood claim that was still unpatented and might be available under the Homestead Acts. And spring brought the news that Maria was expecting their first child, which she told Lionel on a Sunday morning in April when the barn was just finished and the new heifers were in the pasture, and the kitchen garden was planted and the world was doing the thing it does in Kansas in April, turning intensely, almost aggressively green after the winter. She told him at the breakfast table directly, in the way she did everything. "I am expecting a child," she said. "I believe late November or early December." He looked at her for a moment, and then something happened to his face that she had not quite seen before, a kind of full, open happiness that had nothing careful about it. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her face in his hands the way he sometimes did and looked at her for a long time, and she looked back at him, and there was a great deal in that look on both sides. "Are you all right?" he said, because he was a man who asked practical questions first. "I am very well," she said. "I feel excellent, actually." "Good," he said, and then he said, "Maria," in the way he said her name sometimes, as though it meant something specific, and she put her arms around him and held on. The pregnancy was a healthy one. Maria continued to work the farm through the summer with adjustments as needed, and Lionel was attentive without being smothering, which was the exact right proportion. She had been clear early on that she did not intend to become an invalid, and he had been clear that he understood that, and they had managed to navigate the months without either of them becoming someone the other did not recognize. The child was born in late November of 1880, on a cold night with Reverend Hale's wife acting as midwife, as she did for most of the community. Maria was in labor for 12 hours, which was hard and honest work, and at the end of it she held a healthy boy who arrived into the world looking, as Ruth Garrity later observed, exactly like Lionel around the forehead and exactly like Maria around the chin. They named him Thomas for her father. Lionel held his son for the first time sitting in the chair by the fireplace in the front room of the limestone house, and the expression on his face was one that Maria, watching from the bed they had moved to the main room for warmth, did not entirely have words for. It was the same quality as that Sunday morning happiness, but deeper and quieter, as though the feeling had found its true weight. "Thomas," Lionel said quietly to the baby, who was awake and looking at him with the unfocused intensity of the newborn. "You have a very fine name." "He has your frown already," Maria said from the bed. "He does not," Lionel said and looked at her, and she was smiling. Thomas Easton grew with the speed that babies do in the first year, going from helpless and wrinkled to round and opinionated in what seemed to both his parents like an extremely short interval. He had dark hair like Maria and the gray eyes that were the unmistakable Easton contribution, and he was, as far as either of them could tell, temperamentally somewhere between them, curious and determined in equal measure, which seemed about right. Robert Easton did come west, in the spring of 1881, with his wife Agnes and their son Henry and daughter Clara. He filed a homestead claim on 160 acres east of the Underwood place, adjacent land that Lionel had identified for him in correspondence, and the two families were close enough neighbors that Agnes and Maria could visit on foot when the weather was good. Agnes was a cheerful and practical woman from a farming family in Missouri, and she and Maria liked each other immediately and without ceremony, which was a considerable relief to Lionel, who had been quietly anxious about it for months. "Your sister-in-law is remarkable," Maria told him one evening after Agnes had come to visit. "She is," he agreed. "Robert is lucky." "So is she," Maria said, which was generous and true, because Robert Easton had his brother's reliability and a good-natured quality that made him easy to be around. The community of Harlan's Creek was changing in these years, as communities in Kansas were. The cattle drives that had been the great engine of the Wild West economy were slowing as the railroads expanded, and the open range shrank under the pressure of barbed wire fencing, and the homesteaders who were claiming land from one edge of the territory to the other. The town itself was growing, slowly but steadily. There were now 2 doctors, a proper schoolhouse separate from the church, and a new hardware store that had opened next door to Calloway's, run by a man from Ohio named Tibbs. The frontier life was hard always, and Maria and Lionel knew this in their bones. They had both grown up with scarcity, and they both took nothing for granted. There were years when the rain was short, and the grass thin, and the cattle prices low, and the margin between fine and difficult was as narrow as a knife blade. There were years when the work was so relentless that the days blurred together, and the only thing that felt real was the other person at the end of them. There was a terrible early spring in 1882 when a fast-moving prairie fire came within a mile of both the Underwood and the Easton homesteads, and the two families spent 3 days fighting fire lines with every neighbor who could be reached. And Maria stood in the smoke-dark morning with a wet feed sack in her hands and fought fire alongside the men without being asked and without comment. And Lionel watched her from across the fire line and thought, not for the first time, that he had married the most formidable person he had ever met. The fire stopped at Breckenridge Creek and did not reach either homestead, though it took a neighbor's outbuilding and a considerable stretch of grazing land that took 2 seasons to recover. The community came together afterward the way it did in those years, helping each other repair and recover, and there was a solidarity in it that Harlan's Creek was good at, the particular solidarity of people who know that the country they are living in does not owe them anything, and that the only thing standing between them and the worst of it is each other. In the fall of 1882, Maria told Lionel she was expecting their second child. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table directly, and he reacted the same way, coming around the table and holding her face in his hands and looking at her with that full, unhidden happiness. Thomas, who was nearly 2 and was under the table at the time eating a piece of cornbread, had no opinion about this. The second child was born in May of 1883, a girl they named Alina, which had been Lionel's mother's name. Alina arrived in a much shorter labor than Thomas had, and immediately demonstrated a disposition that was louder and more forthcoming than either of her parents, which Ruth Garrity, who came to help for the first week, declared to be a sign of character, and possibly the best thing she had ever seen. "She is going to run this county," Ruth said, looking at the 3-week-old Alina with the authority of a woman who has known a lot of babies. "She is going to run this household," Maria said, which was already evident. Thomas, for his part, accepted his sister with the equanimity of a toddler who has not yet fully grasped the implications, and then, over the following weeks, developed a protective attachment to her that would characterize their relationship for years, always keeping track of where she was and what she was doing with the focused vigilance of a small and very serious shepherd. Old Horace Calloway retired from the general store in 1883, handing it to his eldest son, William, who had been working beside him for a decade and knew the operation as well as his father. On the day of his formal retirement, Horace threw a small gathering at his house above the store to which he invited a handful of long-time customers, including Maria and Lionel, who came with the children. At some point in the afternoon, standing on the porch with a glass of punch, Horace said to Maria, "Do you remember the first time I saw you count coins on my steps?" "I remember it perfectly," she said. "You had the look of your father about you that morning," he said. "That Underwood look. The one that says I will solve this problem myself if it kills me." She laughed, soft and genuine. "Was it that obvious?" "Only to someone who knew your father well," he said. "He had the same look the first spring when the hail took everything, just the same." She was quiet for a moment. "He would have liked Lionel," she said. "He would have," Horace agreed, nodding across the porch to where Lionel was standing with William Calloway and holding Alina, who had fallen asleep on his shoulder with the absolute bonelessness of a small child in a deep sleep. "Very much." By 1884, the Easton Farm, as it was now known in Harlan's Creek, was producing a reliable income from a small beef cattle operation, a good kitchen garden that supplied not only the family but sold surplus to William Calloway's store, and a modest egg and dairy trade that Maria ran with the careful efficiency she brought to everything. They had paid down the last of the original debt years ago and had begun to accumulate a small savings, not wealth by any measure, but security, the real kind, the kind that comes from the land and from consistent work and from a partnership that does not break under pressure. The house had grown too. Lionel had built a second room in the spring of 1882, adding it to the east side of the limestone house, and the following spring he had framed in a porch across the front that became, in warm weather, the heart of the household, where the family spent evenings and where neighbors dropped by and where Thomas, at 4 years old, sat with his father in the long summer evenings learning the names of the stars. This was one of Lionel's quiet gifts, the stars. He had learned them on cattle drives, lying on his back in the dark Texas and Kansas nights, and he passed them along to Thomas the way his own grandfather had passed them to him. A gift that costs nothing and weighs nothing and nevertheless is one of the best things a person can give. Thomas at 4 was already a reliable identifier of Orion and the Dipper and the Pleiades, which he called the 7 small stars because the proper name was beyond him, and which he pointed out to Eleanor at 2 years old with tremendous authority. 7 small stars, he told her, very seriously, one September evening on the porch. Eleanor pointed in the general direction of the sky and said something enthusiastic and incoherent. "That is exactly right," Maria said, from the chair beside Lionel's, and Lionel put his arm around her in the evening dark, and she leaned into his shoulder the way she had learned to lean without it costing her anything, comfortable and easy, and they sat that way in the warm September night with their 2 children, and the stars coming out one by one over the Kansas prairie. There was a disagreement in the winter of 1884 that was their most serious one, the kind that tests what a marriage is made of. It concerned Bert Crabtree, the neighbor who had moved Maria's boundary pin in 1878 and who had been a source of low-level difficulty ever since, making occasional claims about the northern boundary of the Underwood property, and once attempting to graze his cattle on Breckenridge Creek land that was clearly within the Easton claim. Lionel had handled these skirmishes with patience and consistency, always going through legal channels, always documenting, never losing his temper. In the winter of 1884, Crabtree filed a formal legal challenge to the northern boundary of the claim, claiming a survey error that would, if sustained, take 12 acres of the Easton property, including a portion of the creek frontage that was essential to the cattle operation's water access. Lionel wanted to hire a surveyor from Dodge City and fight it through the land office, which was the correct and measured response. Maria wanted to do that and also to go to the county commissioner and present the evidence they had accumulated about Crabtree's history of encroachment to ensure there was a broader understanding of the pattern. The disagreement was not about what to do, but about how much to escalate, and it was heated because they both cared about it, and because they were both right in different ways, and they argued it properly for 2 evenings before arriving at the position that they would do both things simultaneously, which was in fact the best strategy, and which they both knew from the beginning but had needed to fight their way to together. Afterward, sitting by the fire with the argument resolved and the plan made, Maria said, "I am not easy to be married to." He considered this. "You are exactly as easy as you need to be," he said. She looked at him. "That is a very measured answer." "It is an honest one," he said. "I do not want easy, I want you." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Well," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved, "you have me." The Crabtree boundary dispute was resolved in the Eastons' favor in the spring of 1885, when the Dodge City surveyor confirmed the original boundary markers and the land office ruled accordingly. Crabtree sold his homestead 2 years later and moved north to Nebraska, which the community of Harlan's Creek greeted with a certain collective exhale. Thomas started school in 1886 at age 5, walking to the schoolhouse in Harlan's Creek every morning with the children of the Garrity farm and 2 other neighboring homesteaders' families. A small procession of children across the prairie that Maria watched from the front porch on the first morning with a feeling she could not have described precisely, but which had something of time in it, its speed and its weight. Lionel found her still standing there after the children had gone out of sight and the morning was well underway, and he came and stood beside her on the porch without saying anything, which was sometimes the right thing. "He is perfectly capable," she said, after a moment. "He is," Lionel agreed. "He knows more of the sky than his teacher probably does." "He does." She turned and went back inside to start the day's work, and he followed, and the morning opened out into all its usual tasks and requirements, and that was fine. That was what a day was. The summer of 1887 was a good one, abundant in the way that Kansas could be when the rains came right and the heat was not savage. The cattle operation had grown to 30 head, modest but manageable, and the income from the beef sale that fall, combined with everything else, meant that Lionel was able to do something he had been thinking about for 2 years. He went to Dodge City in October and deposited enough money to fully pay off the farmstead, clearing whatever remained of any obligation on the land. He came home and told Maria over dinner, and she sat very still for a moment and then looked at him. "It is fully ours," she said. "Fully," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand, both hands, and held on. Thomas, who was at the table doing his evening school work, looked up and assessed his parents with the composed curiosity of a 7-year-old, and then went back to his slate. Eleanor, who was 4, was under the table where she often was, arranging a collection of smooth stones from the creek in some order that made sense only to her. "Your father would be very pleased," Lionel said. "Yes," she said, and her eyes were bright and she did not look away from his. "He really would." In 1889, Maria gave birth to their third child, a second boy they named James, who arrived in late autumn and who had from his first weeks an equable and sunny temperament that was perhaps the most surprising thing either of them had encountered in a human being. Where Thomas was intense and Eleanor was forceful, James was simply and entirely happy, engaging everyone with an openness that Ruth Garrity said was a direct gift from God, and that Lionel thought probably came from some deep and pleasant combination of the two of them that had averaged out into something much easier than either source. "He is going to be a diplomat," Maria said, watching James at 6 months charming the severe and elderly Mrs. Hale at a church social with nothing but eye contact and a sustained gummy smile. "Or a horse trader," Lionel said. "There is not much difference," Maria said. The 1890s came to the Kansas prairie the way all decades do, carrying some things away and bringing new ones in. The frontier of the Wild West was changing. The open range was largely gone by then, replaced by fenced land, and the cattle drives that had defined Lionel's young years were a memory. The railroad was closer now, with a spur coming through to a town 12 miles from Harlan's Creek in 1891, which changed the economics of everything in ways that were sometimes difficult and sometimes very good. Thomas, who was 11 and had his father's eye for the land and his mother's precision with numbers, was already interested in the new realities, asking questions about beef prices and railroad shipping costs that showed a mind that was heading somewhere serious. Eleanor, at 8, was a force of nature who had decided she wanted to be a school teacher, and was already practicing on her brothers and any neighboring child she could get to hold still. She had Maria's directness and an additional layer of volume that was entirely her own contribution. James, at 3, was still in the diplomatic phase and showed no signs of leaving it. Ruth Garrity's husband Daniel passed away in the winter of 1891, a heart trouble that took him suddenly and left Ruth alone on the farm with their 3 grown children nearby. Maria was at Ruth's side within a day of the news, and she spent 3 days there helping with everything that needed handling, and when she came home she was quiet in the evenings for a week thinking. "She is all right," Maria told Lionel one night. "She is sad, but she is all right. She is a strong woman." "She has been a good friend to you," he said. "The best," Maria said. "Since the beginning she introduced us, you know, at the church social." "I have not forgotten," he said. "I was grateful for it then, and I am more grateful now." She looked at him in the way she had, direct and full of something real. "I am going to invite her for Sunday dinner every week," she said. "She should not be alone at the farm for Sunday meals." "Of course," he said. Ruth came for Sunday dinner every week for the next 15 years, becoming so integrated into the Sunday rhythm of the household that the children could not imagine the week without her. And she sat at the table and ate and argued and told stories and helped with the clearing up after. and it was one of the best arrangements any of them could imagine. Lionel turned 40 in 1888, which he observed with quiet equanimity, and Maria observed by baking him a cake, using the last of the sugar with a precision that told him exactly how much thought had gone into it. He was a man who wore his years well, the outdoor work having kept him lean, and the life he had built having kept something undamaged in him, a quality of engagement with the world that some people lose as they get older, and that he had only refined. His hair was more amber than dark blonde now, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes, and they looked good on him, Maria thought, in the way that years look good on a face that has lived them honestly. She was 37, and she looked at herself sometimes in the mirror of the washstand with the critical eye she brought to everything, and found that she was, if anything, more comfortable in herself than she had been in the earlier years, as though the life she had built had confirmed something she had once only hoped was true about who she was. She moved through the world now with a sureness that was different from the composure of the early years, which had been partly a defense. This was the real thing. They were still good at talking. This was what she valued most, privately, of all the things between them. After 15 years and 3 children and a farm and all the difficulty and all the good of it, they were still genuinely interested in what the other thought. They still argued with pleasure. They still had conversations that went long into the evening after the children were in bed, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. He still made her laugh in the quiet, precise way that she did not do easily with most people. And he still looked at her the way he had in the early days, with that particular quality of attention that was not possessive but was entirely invested, as though what she was, and what she thought, and what she felt continued to be interesting and worth understanding. She had not taken that for granted for a single day of their marriage. The night of their 15th anniversary in April of 1894, the children were old enough that Eleanor, at 11, could be trusted to manage Thomas, who was 13, and James, who was 5, for the evening. Lionel had arranged, with some effort and some help from Agnes Easton next door, to take Maria to dinner at the new hotel in Harlan's Creek that had opened the previous year and had a proper dining room. It was not Dodge City, but it was real tablecloths and candles and a menu, and Maria wore a dress she had bought at William Calloway's store, a dark green wool that she had been keeping for an occasion, and she put on the pearl combs from her mother that she had worn on their wedding day. He was waiting in the front room when she came out, and he was wearing his good suit, which he almost never wore, and when she came through the doorway he looked at her for a long moment without saying anything, and then he said, "You look exactly as you should look." She considered this. "That is either a compliment or it is not," she said. "It is absolutely a compliment," he said, and held out his arm. At dinner they talked in the way they always did, about everything and nothing, about the farm and the children and the news from the county and a book she was reading, and they ate a proper meal with a glass of wine each, which was a rarity, and at some point in the evening he reached across the table and took her hand, which he did sometimes, and held it. 15 years, he said. From $1.14, she said. The best money ever spent in the county, he said, which was what Daniel Garrity had said at the anniversary dinner all those years ago, and she smiled at the memory. Horace Calloway would be pleased to know the story has become a legend, she said. Horace had passed quietly in his sleep in 1892, at 71 years old, having seen his store into the next generation, and his town into something more permanent than the timber frame beginnings had promised. He knew it was a good story, Lionel said. She turned her hand under his and interlaced their fingers, which was something she did rarely and with intention. "I was so angry at you, you know," she said. "That first morning, when I realized someone had settled my bill." "I know you were. I thought I would never find out who it was," she said. "I thought I would have to live with it unresolved. And then you figured it out," he said. "In September," she said. "When I saw you at the store, I knew the moment I saw you before you even said anything by the way you looked at me. There was something in it." She paused, as if you were checking on me. He was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I was," he said. "I found it," she said, looking at him, "both presumptuous and the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years." "A useful combination," he said. "It turned out to be," she said. They walked home from the hotel in the April evening under a sky full of stars, and the town of Harlan's Creek was quiet around them. The saloons lit and audible at one end of the main street, and the dark houses of sleeping families at the other, and the church in the middle with its white-painted front pale in the moonlight. Maria stopped for a moment in front of Calloway's store, now Calloway and Son, with a new painted sign and an expanded stock visible through the darkened window, and she looked at the bottom step where she had sat in July of 1878 and counted her coins. The step was the same step. It had been repaired once, she knew, and the wood had weathered dark, but it was the same timber in the same position, and she had walked past it hundreds of times in 16 years. "Right there," she said, and he knew exactly what she meant. "Yes," he said. She looked at it for a moment longer, and then she turned and they walked home through the spring night to the limestone house where their children were sleeping. And the porch light was on, because Eleanor was too responsible not to leave it lit, and the stars were spread above the Kansas prairie in their indifferent and magnificent abundance, and a warm wind moved through the new grass from the south, and everything that mattered to either of them in the world was within a few miles of where they were standing, and they both knew it. They had a life between them that had been built from almost nothing, from a father's failed crops and a single act of quiet generosity and one cup of coffee, and a great deal of honest, unglamorous work, and it was full and real and entirely theirs, and it would hold. Thomas graduated from the Harlan's Creek School at the top of his class in 1896 and took up the farm management alongside his father with the same systematic thoroughness he had been showing since he was 7. He had a particular gift for the business side of the cattle operation that Lionel did not entirely share, a numerical intuition for markets, and timing that Maria recognized as an extension of her own practicality carried into a new domain. By 18, he was handling the fall cattle sale himself, corresponding directly with the buyers in Kansas City, and getting better prices than most operations twice their size. Eleanor went to the teacher's training college in Dodge City at 17, which required a family discussion that lasted 3 evenings and ended with Maria and Lionel agreeing that she should go, that the money they had saved could support it, and that anyone who had been teaching her brothers and the neighbors' children since age 8 deserved the proper credentials. She came back 2 years later with a teaching certificate and immediately took the position at the Harlan's Creek School that the retiring teacher had held for years, and she was, by the testimony of every parent and student who encountered her, exactly as gifted at it as anyone who had known her at 8 years old had suspected she would be. James, the diplomatic one, took after his father in one specific way. He loved the land. Not the business of it, which Thomas had well in hand, but the physical reality of it, the horses and the cattle and the feel of the seasons changing under his feet. At 12 he was the best rider in the family, at 14 the best judge of cattle, and at 16 Lionel was consulting him genuinely about which animals to cull and which to keep, because the boy had an eye that was simply better than his father's. In the spring of 1897, Thomas married a young woman named Clara Josephine Redd, the daughter of a neighboring homesteader, at the same church where his parents had been married 18 years before. Maria sat in the front pew and felt the particular, complicated mixture of pride and time that comes at a child's wedding, that sense of having brought something all the way to its flowering. Lionel held her hand through the ceremony, which he had not done at their own wedding because they had been standing at the front, and she was grateful for it. After the ceremony, while the celebration was happening in the churchyard, Thomas found his parents standing together near the cottonwood tree, the same tree under whose shade his mother and father had talked for the first time at this very church, and he looked at them both with the serious, contained affection that he had had since boyhood. "Thank you," he said simply, For what specifically? Maria said, because she was his mother. He smiled, and it was Lionel's smile. For showing me what it looks like, he said. A good marriage. I have been watching you my whole life. I know what it looks like now. Maria looked at her son and felt something move through her that had no exact name. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have been so proud of you." "I know," Thomas said. "I hope to deserve it." He went back to his new wife, and Maria stood with Lionel in the shade of the cottonwood for a moment, and she said quietly, "He is right, you know, that it is a thing worth showing them." "We managed to be their parents and ourselves at the same time," Lionel said. "That is probably the best anyone can do." She looked up at him. "I think we did considerably better than that," she said. He looked at her with the gray eyes that had, after 20 years, exactly the same quality of attention that they had always had, that specific stillness that was not emptiness but care. He bent and kissed her temple, brief and warm, and she leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, and then they both straightened and went to join their family in the Kansas afternoon light. The years after that settled into the fullness that a well-built life has in its maturity, still active and full of events and growth and difficulty and joy, but with a foundation under it that did not shake. There were grandchildren eventually, Thomas and Clara's first boy arriving in 1899, a healthy and vocal child they named Thomas Robert after his grandfather and his great uncle, and who Lionel held for the first time with an expression that was the same open, undisguised happiness that had been on his face when Thomas himself was born 2 decades before. Maria held her grandson and looked at the wide, wondering face of him, and thought of her father sitting in the limestone house the winter before he died, telling her that the land was what mattered, that you built something in a place and it stayed after you. It carried something of you forward in the people who came after. She thought he had understood it more as an abstraction then, a comfort to hold on to. Now she understood it in her hands, literally, in the weight of this small person who was both entirely new and a continuation of everything that had come before. Her father's hands building the house, Lionel's quiet act of generosity on the store steps, all the years of work and argument and love, and the careful, honest life they had built from the ground up on the Kansas prairie. "Hello, Thomas Robert," she said softly. "You have a very fine name." Lionel was at her shoulder, looking at the baby and then at her, and she felt him there the way she always felt him there, steady and warm and her own, and she reached back with one hand and found his, and held on. Outside the limestone house that Thomas Underwood had built with quarried stone and his own hands, the Kansas prairie stretched in every direction under the wide sky, the same sky it had always been, indifferent and enormous and beautiful, and the grass moved in the summer wind the way it had moved for 10,000 years and would move after all of them. And the farmstead that had started as one man's dream, and a woman alone with a milk cow and 4 chickens, was now a full and living place with a barn and a porch, and a garden, and children and grandchildren and neighbors who came for Sunday dinner, all of it grown from $1.14, and a man who had looked at a woman on a step, and understood, in the simple and accurate way of someone who has spent years reading the land, that something mattered here and that it was worth the trouble. It had been worth every cent.